Some people may know is when we started 1X and had a different name back then, we had an initial management structure that was very similar to the Constellation program management structure. That is, the people who were making the first stage booster part were part of the first stage office, were part of the ARES project. And people who were doing the avionics were part of the ARES project. People who were doing the ground part were part of the ground ops project. And because the reporting chain was through the established projects, it was a very difficult thing to put your arm around and say, this is ARES 1X. What you saw was, this is the path for ARES 1X for first stage, here's the path for the mainline Constellation part for first stage, and same with upper stage, same with avionics. So you could see how it was working out, but the ARES folks would have their perspective on how it should fit together, what the right step forward would be, which would be different than on the ground side. We're kind of going through their chain. We didn't have any integrating function from a management point of view to say, no, I'm responsible for it, I'll pull it together, and I'll make the call, even though it may not make you happy. We got to do what's best for the system. So we followed the Constellation process, and that slowed us down a lot. And decisions weren't being made, and we talk about a lot of things. And so we had to reorganize in a way that was very, very focused and very efficient.
So in April of 2007, a lean event was called by senior management. Champion was Dan Dumbacher, and they sequestered a group of, I want to say it was 12 or 15 of us that kind of represented the different parts of 1X and said, hey, we're not getting where we need to be. What do we need to do? And from that event, we came up with the IPTs. We streamlined things down from, there were processes that were requiring 10 panels to get a decision to basically 3. We really looked at what our goal was, what we needed to get there, and then we reorganized.
And we started with a clean board, saying, here, what do we need? We said, okay, we need someone who provides the hardware. Someone's got to provide a first stage. Someone's got to provide an upper stage, and et cetera, for all the hardware providers. Then we said, we need someone to do the integrating. And he said, that's basically all you need. There's a person in charge of the project, there's a person who provides, there's people who provide all the hardware, and there's an entity that integrates all this together. And that became our org structure. It was as flat as you possibly could draw it.
They reorganized the whole project so that each IPT had their own budget, their own schedule authority. That seemed to me make things run a lot smoother. Up until that point, you would ask for a change, and it may take months of just telecon after telecon. So the important lesson learned there for me, from my perspective, was you have to have a strong SE&I up front. You have to have an SE&I that has the technical authority as well as an integrated schedule across the IPTs that all the IPTs have to adhere to and honor. Even at the end of the project, there was still some disconnects, but I think overall they had finally gotten to the point where they had an integrated schedule where all the IPTs fed into that. They understood the right milestones, and so they were all on the same sheet of music. But until they reorganized that, they didn't. So, if you're going to do this again up front, you've got to get SE&I involved. SE&I traditionally is, what are my loads, what's my trajectory, those type things, but also in what Shuttle would call level 2, they also maintain the overall project schedule and the overall project budget. And so to me, I think that was important.
When you're working within a big program and it is it has a lot on its plate, it's got lots to do, that it's very hard to go and get the attention that you need to go work on this test flight. So it's very advantageous to you to have this focus team that's set up just to work on the test flight. It's out of the bureaucracy of the big program and what it's trying to get accomplished. And it's got a direct link, though, back to the program manager so that he knows that this is his team that's working it. And it relieves some of that work off of him so that he can stay focused on the big picture. But your team can stay focused just on what you're trying to do. Your team has got accountability from budgets, decision, technical, schedule. You have all that authority to go make your job happen.
So it made the lines of communication very clear. Each of the IPT leads, who were then reporting back to their projects, back to Constellation, now reported to the project manager directly, as did the integration lead. And if there was a problem, there was one meeting to go to. There was one control board, And by doing that, it was always acknowledged what that forum is and who to talk to. And so our efficiency of communication, which is the key to any project management, but our efficiency of communication increased dramatically. We went to a very, very flat organization structure. And there was one control board for the whole mission. It was our ARES 1X control board. We called it the XCB. That way made all the decisions based on all the requirements, had all the cost, schedule, and technical risk authority that was delegated by the Constellation program manager. And by doing that, things happened quickly. We get together with the right folks. It was one meeting. You made a decision. You pressed on. There was not a separate board to go to. There was not other factors happen in the background. So that change to the organizational structure was very enabling for ARES 1X.
The way that our vehicle was organized in the organizational structure, it was set up as a very flat organization where the XCB or our mission manager had the authority to decide whether a yes or no on pretty much any of the stances or any of the decisions that needed to be made. It made it very efficient for us moving forward fastly. Had we not had that, we probably wouldn't have flown when we did. It also cut down a lot of people trying to reopen issues, because once the issue had actually been set, people agreed that that was where it was supposed to be. Also, since we were brought in from many different centers, we worked as a badgeless, centerless team, and our mission manager enforced that dramatically through the XCB. We were all ARES 1X. We were not part of the centers at that point.
There was always a concern that by having one board, that you'd overload that board, and if you wanted to get something to that board, that you would have to, wait. It would take a while, and it would be a bottleneck. And the companion way of doing it is to add another board to take care of, or triage, so to speak, those items that didn't need to go to the senior board. As we talked through that, we came to the conclusion was the fact that you really have it's really the same people who goes to that subordinate board, except for the project manager. So it sounds good on paper, and you can handle all these things at a, quote, lower level, but still the IPT leads go into that meeting at the subordinate board. So instead of having the meeting over here at the XCB, you'd have it over here at the subordinate board. Well, does that save you anything or not? And the conclusion we came to was no, let's just do it once, and if it gets to the point that we're overloaded, then we'll talk about adding a subordinate board. And we never did add a subordinate board. We just had more meetings. So our XCBs did get a little oppressive at times. Sometimes they go from 8 in the morning till 10 at night, and we go through a dozen different items. So there were times when it was tough. It was harder to get something through. But the good thing about our pace is that instead of the meeting on Tuesday, you could have a meeting on Thursday, 2 days later, to get your item through. So whatever bottleneck that we saw, the bottleneck was measured in days, not weeks or months like you may see in some other program structure. As we got closer and closer to the operations, we found these specialty topics, so to speak, that only included a handful of folks. So we created 3 other boards as time went on to handle these focused topics. One had to do with our instrumentation, or development flight instrumentation, or DFI. And there's always little nitnoid. This is a broken wire. This is a sensor that isn't working, or a test isn't coming out right. That, because of our single board structure, would bubble up to the XCB for a decision. But that was not the right level of information, right level of topic that the XCB should be talking about. This has to do with a wire for instrumentation that's not mandatory. So we created the separate control board and basically said, just deal with it. You talk about all that day-to-day miscellaneous stuff with sensors, and if you get to the point where you have a big system problem or an overall issue with our DFI suite, then bring it up to the XCB and we'll talk about it. But do all you can to handle it, on your own. That worked great. I mean, it really took the XCB, took all the DFI stuff out of the XCB and allowed us to concentrate on big areas, like making sure that the loads are right and making sure our vehicle is integrated properly. That's the important stuff. We also created a board about processing problems. There'd be a problem on the floor, didn't have the right paperwork, or a nut wouldn't fit, or something like that. And we didn't want to deal with the XCB. We wanted decisions like on the floor, real time. So we created what we call the TXRB, which is basically just a processing board. And our chief engineer at KSE chaired that board, and it was his responsibility to solve those problems as fast as he can. And mostly it was measured in hours when he had a problem as to when he solved it. So we evolved from one structure into one structure with a couple of very focused boards to handle day-to-day, near real-time kind of decisions. Now, the lessons learned for us, while that worked out really well, we established those boards pretty late in the game. And essentially, one week we were doing the XCB, another week we said, okay, now here's the new board, let's go use it. And for some folks, that was too much of a change too quickly as to what that board responsibility was, how the process worked, all the configuration management aspects of it. So to do it again, we'd start with one board. We would establish on paper these other subordinate boards and say there's a point in time we're going to use this board. It's not today, but when we do it, here's how it's going to be, here's the charter, here's how we're going to handle CM, and therefore people know what's coming, and it's not a surprise as to how we're going to go do it. It was just the discussion is just when we actually enact those boards. That would have been smoother for the team if we said the DFI, control board is going to start 6 months from now. And here's how it's going to happen. We did a lot of just-in-time stuff. We realized that we needed it, so we started it. But again, to do it all over again, the more you can plan for the evolution of your board structure, the better. When we first started off setting this up with 1X after our new reorg part of it, we had two deputies, and frankly, there were some politics involved. I was a Johnson Space Center person. Having somebody who represented Marshall Space Flight Center, where most of the stuff was being designed, made sense. Having somebody at Kennedy Space Center, where everything was going to end up and have a big key for the operations, made sense. So that kind of made a lot of folks happy overall in the Constellation program. They can see kind of like their person is there. But the reality of it, that really was not the motivating factor. It was the fact that being either at JSC or when I was at Langley, there's a lot of day-to-day stuff that happens that people want to talk to the project manager for. And so having a deputy at Marshall Space Flight Center really made a big deal. They could walk over to this person, Steve Davis, and just talk about things. It may not be worth going to an XCB control board. It may not be worth elevating to me and say this is a big deal, but just I'm not sure about this. I'm curious about this. And having somebody that would listen. And then deputies did a great job of filtering out what stuff they said, hey, this is a big deal. This is the second or third time I've heard about this concern. Let's talk about it. Or they would handle it on themselves if it was just an isolated incident or something unique. And so one of the things we tried hard not to do was make our deputies a deputy for the vehicle and a deputy for the ground operations. Because that put the kind of divide that now we have these two structures. All the ground ops guys would report through this deputy. All the vehicle guys would report through this deputy. That would separate our project, I thought, and put a line in the middle. So we were very clear to say our deputies are my deputies, and they can talk about any topic. One happens to live at Marshall Space Flight Center. One happens to live at Kennedy Space Center. But there were times when there was a topic related to the vehicle, and my deputy, who happened to be at Kennedy Space Center, was the one in charge to go solve that problem, and vice versa. Because I wanted two people who were equal deputies that could solve any problem, who happened to have different centers behind them, but not a vehicle person and a ground person. And so the org part of it for 1X was really careful about interfaces and layers. And all those are bad. So we wanted to minimize the number of layers, so we had a very flat organization, a manager and the hardware providers, and that was it. In Constellation, they like to say level 2, level 3, level 4, and we ban those phrases. You cannot say level 2 or level 3 within 1X without being chastised. Because once you do that, you just create a line. You just drew a line in the org chart, which doesn't really exist. You do this, and I do this, and you can't do this, and I can't do that. We couldn't handle that. We just had a team. And you're providing a service, and this person's integrating, and this person makes the final decision. And there's no levels there. It's just part of the integrated team. The other part of it is interfaces. Every time you create an organization or boxes an organization chart, you create an interface. So one thing is to be careful of with a flat org chart, it becomes wide. Now you have all these different kind of interfaces. But we wanted to make sure we didn't create these interfaces and someone to manage the interface and someone to make sure that you integrate the management of the interfaces. Pretty soon you go in this big circle of all these people getting involved doing stuff, this generic stuff. People who integrate and facilitate and coordinate. If that's your job title, you probably need to find a better job because by org structure you can get rid of a lot of that stuff. And you have the people who are empowered to make a decision, in a box, say, okay, you're in charge of this, period. Make the call. So the org structure really determines how big your organization has to be from a project management point of view. It determines how many people you have in staff positions or administrative positions, just kind of keeping tabs of another organization. And once you start doing that, you realize you must have, taken a wrong turn somewhere. If you have a lot of folks whose sole job is to worry about what other folks are doing, but not having the responsibility to make a difference. So in an SC&I world, what we wanted, and we evolved into this, but it took a while, was interface managers that were really interface managers, not a book manager for the first stage, upper stage, not someone who goes to the meetings and sees the first stage guys are talking to the upper stage guys, but someone says, you're the guy who makes the call between first stage and upper stage. You manage that interface. You don't integrate and coordinate and facilitate. That's what you do to get there. But in the end, you say, and here's what we're going to go do. And for our project, for Constellation, for other projects, Initially you tend to put people who are more detail-oriented, good at maybe documenting and writing to be the book managers for a particular interface. And what you need are people who are mini project managers. Manage that interface. If there's 180 bolts between your piece and their piece, there's a lot of issues to talk about. What kind of bolts, how big they are, the thread, the preload, the interface, metal-to-metal contact. Someone has to make calls on all of those. And often the call is not beneficial to a particular IPT. They got to make a change. They got to change their material. They got to do an extra test. They got to do something. And so you need somebody who is empowered to say, and given the authority, this is my job. I own this interface, and here's what I recommend. What recommend to me, but decide to those folks. And if those folks say, hey, wait a minute, you're just cost me $10 million in 6 months of a schedule slip, then we elevate up to a higher level. Now it's a cost schedule issue that I would get involved in. But the best you can, let people actively manage with authority your key interfaces, and not just make them book managers.
That was so big. And that's what I really loved about our flat organizational structure. It was not far from Bob S., our mission manager, wasn't far down to the person on the floor turning the wrench. And when you have that, and when you have the mission manager and deputy mission managers traveling around, going to see people, being there, you get to know them. It short circuits a lot of stuff that in a large program might fester. People wondering, well, why are we doing that? Well, if you see the deputy mission manager or the mission manager himself on the floor every day, and when we got to KSC, you saw all three of us there every day. You can short circuit some of that stuff. It is just really huge, and you're talking to people. You got to, and the talk has to go up and down.
When you needed an answer or a decision, basically you knew you were within 3 meetings or 3 people of getting that's the decision. Maybe the downside of that is you might not have always necessarily gotten all the data you needed, but on a test flight program, our philosophy was, better is the enemy of good enough. And because we had a very small time frame, we were given a small window. We basically had 2.5 years from April of 2007, well, it was 2 years originally, till April of 2009 to finish designing a rocket, building the components, assembling the components, testing them, and putting it out in the launch pad to launch. So you had to be more accessible. That's the other thing about having a leaner management. Typically that makes you more accessible. So people are able to get problems to the right level much faster. So the issue with that, though, is sometimes those people could become overwhelmed. So you've got to find that balance, and so that's kind of maybe the downside of flattening the management organization too much. But the lessons from that, though, is I think this is where we as an agency, I think, are trying to go. If we flatten our organization, that means we should allow the people at lower levels more degree of authority and freedom to make some decisions that maybe right now we're pushing up.